Chapter 4, Lesson 3, The Plymouth Colony. What to know. Why did the English settle in New England? Learn how people lived in the Plymouth Colony. Describe the cooperation and conflict between English settlers and American Indians. Explain how English settlers developed ways to govern themselves. Vocabulary to know and to study in Quizlet. Pilgrim, Compact, Self-government, Majority rule. People will meet in this chapter. King Henry VIII, William Bradford, Samoset, Tisquantum, also known as Squanto. Places, Plymouth. You are there. You are deep in the cargo hold of a ship. You have barely enough light to see, and the air is so stale that you wish you didn't have to breathe. The ship is rising and falling with the waves, but you're getting used to that. Your mother brings you your dinner: dry bread, cold, dried meat, and an onion. You've been living like this for 2 months, below deck on the Mayflower. North America will have to be a wonderful place, you think, to make this awful trip worthwhile. Page 171. The first heading is the Pilgrims Journey. So write this heading down in your notes, and let's look for important ideas that we can add to your notes from this section. John Smith left Jamestown and in 1614 explored north along the Atlantic coast. He made a map of the northern area he explored, named the region New England, and wrote a book called A Description of New England. Today, the region includes 6 states: Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. Many people in England read Smith's book. It made them think about building new communities in the region he described. Some people wanted to move there to make money, and others wanted to move there for religious reasons. Years earlier, King Henry VIII had outlawed the Catholic Church in England and replaced it with the Church of England. Everyone in England had to belong to the Church of England, and those who chose not to were punished. That's called having an established religion. Hoping to follow their own religious beliefs, one group of English people had moved to the Netherlands. They were known as separatists because they had left or separated from the Church of England. In time, they came to be known as pilgrims, because a pilgrim is a person who makes a journey for religious reasons. The Pilgrims had religious freedom in the Netherlands, but they did not like the Dutch ways. They wanted to build their own society and to worship as they pleased. In North America, the Pilgrims would get their chance. The Virginia Company agreed to pay the Pilgrims' passage to North America. In return, the Pilgrims would repay the company with lumber, which is wood, and fur, from animal, from their new home. They left England in 1620 on a ship called the Mayflower. Why did the Pilgrims want to go to North America? What can you add to your notes? In this painting, pilgrims board rowboats, boats to row, to make their way toward the Mayflower. Women were not given the chance to sign the Mayflower Compact because at this time in history, women had fewer rights than men had. The Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower was headed for Virginia, but things did not go as planned because storms blew the ship off course. The Mayflower landed at Cape Cod in what is now Massachusetts. And excuse me, I didn't remind you. Here's a new heading. Let's write that heading down in your notes. The settlers arrived in a place with no government. To keep order, all of the men aboard the Mayflower signed a compact or agreement. This document became known as the Mayflower Compact. The signers agreed that fair laws would be made for the good of the colony, and they promised to obey these laws. This meant that they would govern themselves. At a time when monarchs ruled, self-government was a very new idea. The Mayflower Compact gave everyone who signed it the right to share in making laws. But women were not allowed to sign, so they could not help make laws. It also included the idea of majority rule. If more than half the people agreed to a law or a decision, everyone had to follow it. The settlers took several weeks to find a place for their colony. They chose a site on a harbor. Fresh water and good land for growing crops were nearby. John Smith had named the place Plymouth. William Bradford, a leader of the Pilgrims, wrote, "Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven." Why was the Mayflower Compact important? And I'll remind you that the word monarch means king. This is a very important idea that people could govern themselves. It kind of sets up for our country and our representative democracy. Okay, next section, building a colony. Please write that in your notes. And let's read to see what is important or interesting to add. Although the settlers tried to make wise decisions, the first winter was very hard. It was cold and long, and by spring, 50 of the 102 settlers who had reached Cape Cod had died. In the spring, the survivors got a very welcome surprise when an Abenaki Indian named Samoset arrived, saying, "Welcome, Englishmen." Samoset had learned English from sailors who fished along the Atlantic coast. Several days later, Samoset returned to Plymouth with Tisquantum, or Squanto, as the English called him. He was a Wampanoag Indian who spoke English. He spoke English quite well. Years before, Tisquantum had been taken and sold as a slave in Spain. After he escaped, he spent several years in England before at last returning to his homeland. Tisquantum stayed with the Plymouth colonists, showing them where to fish and how to plant squash, pumpkins, and corn. Because food was scarce, the Pilgrims were glad to live in peace with the Wampanoag. Both groups benefited from their cooperation. The colonists and the Indians both had valuable items that the other group wanted. Tisquantum helped the colonists trade for furs from neighboring Indian tribes. The Indians were able to trade furs for items such as metal goods and cloth. Metal goods were especially valuable to the Indians because the metal could be reshaped and used to make tools, or jewelry. So how did Tisquantum or Squanto help the Pilgrims? People can visit this recreation of the Plymouth settlement to see how colonists lived. Road trip. Okay, cultural heritage, Thanksgiving Day. This painting gives an artist's view of the first Thanksgiving. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims gathered their first harvest. William Bradford, governor of the Plymouth colony, decided they should have a celebration to rejoice together and to give thanks to God. Since this festival would come at the same time as the Indian celebration of the autumn harvest, he invited the neighboring Wampanoag Indians to join the Pilgrims for the 3-day festival. The Plymouth Festival is what many people today think of as the first Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving became a national holiday in the United States in 1683. That year, President Abraham Lincoln declared the last Thursday in November as Thanksgiving Day. And the next section, Plymouth grows. Write that in your notes, please. When the Plymouth colonists first arrived, there was very little food available. To help, the colony's leaders decided that the harvest would be divided equally among the families. Then, in 1623, the leaders decided to divide the land among the colonists. The result was that the people worked harder. The Plymouth colonists began to prosper, to grow rich from their farming, as well as from fishing and fur trading. As new colonists arrived, earlier colonists had extra goods ready to trade. However, the population of Plymouth remained low during its first 10 years. By 1630, there were only about 300 colonists. After 1630, other English colonists began to settle in different areas of New England, and life there began to change. Many of the new colonists were not friendly towards the Indians and settled on more of their lands. Some colonists did not see a need to cooperate with the Indians. As conflicts between the Indians and the colonists increased, trade between the two groups ended. This made life more difficult for the colonists and the Indians. Over time, the way the groups felt about one another changed. William Bradford, one of Plymouth's early governors, had once helped make peace with local Indians, but he later supported a war to push many Indians out of New England. Such actions also caused problems between Indian tribes. As the amount of available land decreased, tribes often fought with each other for control over hunting grounds. So how did the relationship between Indians and the colonists change? And please think about those words, cooperation and conflict. In summary, the Pilgrims left Europe to find religious freedom. When they arrived in Plymouth, the settlers wrote the Mayflower Compact to set up self-government. Early on, American Indians helped the colonists, but later the two sides stopped cooperating. Questions for review. Be sure you have answers. For small group work. Why did the English settle in New England? Write a sentence about the Plymouth colony using the terms compact and self-government. Why were women not allowed to help make laws in the Plymouth colony? Do you think the ideas of the Mayflower Compact are still important to people today? Why or why not? Is the Mayflower Compact a primary source? Primary or secondary? Why or why not? And if you're looking for creative ideas, check out number 6.